In the grand and sprawling tapestry of Chinese history, woven with threads of gold and silk, of imperial decrees and epic battles, there exist shadowed corners, deliberately unlit and forgotten. These are the spaces where the official narratives fall silent, where the ink of the court chronicler runs dry, and where the stark, uncomfortable truths of human experience were meant to dissolve into the mists of time. We are taught of emperors and their consorts, of the intricate hierarchies of the female imperial harem, a world of ambition, beauty, and tragedy. But there is another story, a parallel narrative of exploitation so profound, so deeply unsettling to the codified morals of the age, that it was spoken of only in whispers or rendered in the most delicate and obscuring euphemisms. This is the story of the Wantong, the Nanchong, the male concubines of ancient China. It is the story of boys bought and sold like precious porcelain, their youth a commodity, their bodies a canvas for the desires of the powerful, and their souls systematically hollowed out in the gilded cages of wealth and influence. To truly understand this phenomenon, one must ask a fundamental question. How could a civilization so deeply rooted in the rigid patriarchy of Confucianism, a philosophy that prized family lineage, filial piety, and the strict separation of gender roles above all else, sustain a thriving, open market for the intimate use of young men? The answer is not simple. It lies in a complex interplay of absolute power, economic desperation, and a staggering societal hypocrisy that allowed for the coexistence of contradictory realities. This was not a story of love or of alternative relationships freely chosen. It was a story of human trafficking, of institutionalized abuse, where the victims were not only stripped of their freedom, but of their very identities. We will journey into this darkness to uncover the process by which a boy became a thing, to witness the brutal mechanics of his training, the fleeting, terrifying heights of his favor, and the inevitable, crushing abyss of his disposal. This is the untold history of the silent, beautiful boys who served the masters of the Middle Kingdom, whose fleeting lives were a testament to the fact that in the pursuit of power and pleasure, no boundary is truly sacred, and no human life is safe from being rendered a disposable object. The foundation of this grim institution was not built on aberrant desire, but on the cold, hard bedrock of poverty. Across the vast agricultural landscapes of imperial China, life for the peasant class was a relentless cycle of toil, famine, and uncertainty. A single failed harvest, a flood, or a punitive tax could push a family from subsistence to starvation. In this crucible of desperation, a family's children were often their only remaining asset. While daughters were sold as maids, servants, or brides, a particularly beautiful son represented a different, more lucrative, and far more tragic opportunity. A handsome boy with delicate features, a clear voice, and an intelligent air could fetch a price that might save his entire family from ruin. This transaction was the first and most profound act of severing. It was a choice born of impossibility, a father and mother condemning their own child to an unknown, unspeakable fate in order to ensure the survival of his siblings. They would receive a sum of silver, a temporary reprieve from destitution, and in exchange, their son would vanish from their lives forever, his name erased from the family records, his existence becoming a shameful, unspoken secret. The demand for these boys came from the apex of society, powerful court eunuchs, wealthy merchants whose fortunes were newly made, high-ranking officials, and, most consequentially, the emperors themselves. In a world where a man's power was absolute, it extended over everything and everyone within his domain. The acquisition of beautiful objects, be it jade, art, or people, was a demonstration of status. A stable of exquisite horses, a collection of rare scrolls, and a retinue of beautiful male attendants were all part of the same theater of power. While Confucian doctrine dictated that a man's primary duty was to produce a male heir with his wife, what he did for his own pleasure was, for a long time, a matter of personal discretion, provided it did not disrupt the social order. This created a bifurcated morality. The public sphere was governed by rigid Confucian propriety, while the private sphere of the wealthy was a space of indulgence, a realm where desires, suppressed by social convention, could be explored. The concept of non-sa, or male beauty, was a recognized aesthetic and erotic category. Poetry and art celebrated the grace of the young male form, often comparing it to jade, willow trees, or blossoms. This aesthetic appreciation provided a veneer of cultural sophistication to what was, at its core, a brutal market in human flesh. The boys chosen for this life were often identified at a startlingly young age, sometimes as early as 8 or 9 years old. They were sought out by brokers, talent scouts with a keen eye for potential, who traveled the countryside and the poorer districts of cities. These men were not just looking for a pretty face, they were assessing raw material. They looked for a delicate bone structure that promised a slender, almost androgynous physique into adolescence. They listened for a soft, melodious speaking voice. They observed the boy's intelligence, his capacity for learning, and, most importantly, a certain docility, a pliability of spirit that suggested he could be molded. The ideal candidate was a blank slate upon which a master's desires could be written. Once a boy was selected and the price negotiated with his desperate family, his old life ceased to exist with shocking finality. He was taken from his home, often in the dead of night, and transported to a world of opulent terror that was as alien to him as another planet. He was no longer a son or a brother. He was now an investment, a piece of raw material to be refined. The moment of transition, the catalytic event that marked the end of childhood and the beginning of a living nightmare, was the entry into the training house. These were establishments dedicated to a singular, monstrous purpose: the systematic deconstruction of a human being and his reassembly into a perfect object of pleasure. Upon arrival, the first thing stripped from a boy was his name. His birth name, the one given to him by his parents, was a link to his past, to his identity, to a time when he was a person. It was immediately replaced with a new, elegant, and often feminized name: Jade Petal, Spring Willow, Little Phoenix, names that reinforced his status as a beautiful, decorative thing. This nominal erasure was the first step in a profound psychological assault. He was taught that his old self was dead, and any reference to his family or his former life was met with severe punishment. The goal was to induce a state of total disorientation, to sever every anchor to his past, leaving him adrift and utterly dependent on his new keepers. The initial consequences of this transition were overwhelming. The boy was plunged into a world of incomprehensible rules and rituals. He was surrounded by other boys, all with the same look of terrified bewilderment in their eyes. The opulence of his surroundings, the silk cushions, the carved wooden screens, the scent of expensive incense, was a cruel mockery of his new reality. It was a cage, albeit a gilded one. His initial reactions would have been those of any child torn from his home: fear, grief, and a desperate longing for his mother. But these emotions were liabilities, weaknesses to be expunged. Crying was punished. Sulking was punished. Any display of individuality or defiance was met with swift and calculated cruelty. The pain was a tool, used not just to enforce obedience, but to teach a fundamental lesson. Your body is not your own. Your feelings are not your own. Nothing is yours except the duty to please. This was the turning point from which there was no return. The gate of the training house had closed behind him, and the path forward led only deeper into the artifice of his new existence. The development of a boy into a finished product was a long, arduous, and deeply scarring process. It was an education in erasure. The curriculum was divided into several disciplines, each designed to perfect a different facet of his performance as a living work of art. The physical regimen was exacting. The boys were kept on strict diets to prevent them from developing a robust, masculine build. They were fed foods believed to promote smooth skin and a slender frame. Their bodies were constantly monitored, every ounce of flesh scrutinized. They were trained in movement, taught to walk with a specific gliding grace, to handle a teacup with delicate precision, to bow and kneel with a fluidity that was both submissive and aesthetically pleasing. Every gesture was choreographed, every posture perfected, until the artifice became second nature. It was a physical language of subservience, drilled into their very muscles. Simultaneously, they underwent an intense intellectual and artistic education, a cruel paradox that armed them with the culture of the elite while denying them the humanity to be part of it. They were taught to play musical instruments, most commonly the guqin, a seven-stringed zither whose melancholic tones were considered the height of scholarly refinement. They spent countless hours practicing, their fingers growing calloused, their minds filled with ancient melodies. They were taught to sing, to compose poetry in the classical style, and to practice calligraphy, their brushstrokes trained to be as elegant as their movements. They studied literature and history, not for their own enlightenment, but so they could engage in clever, witty conversation and entertain their master and his guests. They became repositories of culture, able to recite the great poets of the Tang dynasty or debate the subtleties of a philosophical text. This education was the ultimate refinement of their objectification. It made them more interesting, more valuable commodities. They were not just beautiful bodies, they were beautiful minds packaged for consumption. The tragedy lay in their awareness. They were given the tools to understand the beauty of the world, but were trapped in an existence of profound ugliness. The psychological conditioning, however, was the most insidious part of their training. It was a constant, low-grade campaign of terror and manipulation designed to break their will and ensure absolute loyalty. The system operated on a precarious balance of reward and punishment. A boy who performed well, who learned his lessons quickly and displayed the correct attitude of cheerful subservience, would be rewarded with small comforts, a sweet cake, a new silk robe, a word of praise. This praise was addictive, a fleeting moment of validation in a world of constant criticism. The boys learned to crave it, to compete for it. They were deliberately pitted against one another, fostering an environment of jealousy and suspicion. A boy who saw another receiving favor would feel a pang of fear. His own position was threatened. Friendships were dangerous, alliances impossible. Each boy was an island of isolated ambition, his primary goal to outshine the others and secure his place. Section: the alternative to favor was punishment, and it was a constant looming threat. The methods were varied and psychologically devastating. Beatings were common, but often the cruelty was more refined. Solitary confinement in a dark room for days on end. Withholding of food. Humiliation in front of the other boys. The trainers were masters of psychological torture, knowing exactly how to exploit a child's fears. The most effective weapon was the threat of being deemed a failure. A boy who could not be molded, who remained defiant or simply lacked the requisite talent, was a failed investment. His fate was to be discarded, sold off to a common brothel, or simply thrown out onto the streets, a fate far worse than the gilded cage he currently inhabited. This terror of failure became the primary motivator, driving the boys to push themselves beyond the limits of endurance, to suppress their own personalities more completely, to become the perfect, smiling, soulless automatons their keepers desired. During this period of intense development, there were no real avenues for escape or intervention. Who could they appeal to? Their families had sold them and, in many cases, had moved or could not be found. Even if they could be located, the contract was binding. The family had accepted the silver. Society at large offered no refuge. A runaway male concubine was a piece of stolen property. He had no legal standing, no rights. Anyone who harbored him would be breaking the law and risking the wrath of his powerful owner. Their attempts to regain control were therefore small, internal, and almost always doomed. A boy might try to hold on to a memory of his mother's face, a secret corner of his mind that remained his own. He might perform his duties with a hidden, simmering resentment. But these acts of internal rebellion were unsustainable. The daily reality of their existence, the constant performance, the ever-present fear ground down their resistance over time. The persona they were forced to adopt began to merge with their sense of self. The mask started to eat away at the face beneath. The psychological and emotional toll of this process was catastrophic. The boys were trapped in a state of perpetual adolescence, their emotional development arrested. They lived in a constant state of anxiety, a high-strung awareness of their master's every mood. A frown, a sharp word, an impatient gesture. Any of these could signal a fall from favor and the beginning of the end. This fostered a deep-seated paranoia. They trusted no one, not the household staff, and certainly not the other boys who were their rivals. As they grew older, this anxiety morphed into a profound melancholy, a deep, abiding sadness that even the most rigorous training could not entirely conceal. It was a sadness born of their lost childhood, their stolen humanity, and the terrifying precariousness of their existence. Many would have suffered from what we would now recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, their personalities fractured by the systematic abuse they had endured. They became experts at concealing their inner turmoil behind a flawless facade of grace and contentment, a performance that was both their greatest skill and their most profound tragedy. The impact of their presence on the household was complex. To the master, they were a source of pleasure and a symbol of his status. To the master's wife and female concubines, they were a source of humiliation and rivalry. They diverted the master's affection, attention, and resources. In many households, a bitter, silent war was waged between the female quarters and the male favorites, a war of whispers, gossip, and subtle sabotage. The male concubines were often seen as unnatural, an affront to the proper order of the family. They were isolated within the family structure, belonging to no recognized category, loved by none, and envied or despised by many. This alienation only deepened their dependence on their master, the single source of their security and their suffering. Their world shrank until it contained only one person, and his whims became the sole determinant of their reality. They were trapped, not just by walls and guards, but by a web of psychological, social, and emotional dependencies from which there was no escape. The climax of a male concubine's life was not a moment of triumph, but a slow, creeping dread. It was the dawning realization of an unalterable biological truth. He was getting older. In a world where his entire value was predicated on youth and delicate beauty, the natural process of maturation was a death sentence. The first signs were subtle. A slight deepening of the voice, the faintest shadow of a beard on his upper lip that required more frequent plucking, a hardening of the jawline, a broadening of the shoulders. To an ordinary young man, these are welcome signs of impending manhood. To the male concubine, they were harbingers of doom. Each new sign of maturity was a crack in the perfect porcelain facade he had been trained to maintain. This initiated a period of frantic, desperate crisis. The young man would resort to any means necessary to halt the relentless march of time. He would use powders and paints to maintain the illusion of a flawless, pale complexion. He would become obsessive about his diet, starving himself to keep his frame slender. He would practice his arts with a renewed fervor, hoping his wit or musical talent could compensate for his fading physical perfection. His state during this climax was one of pure, unadulterated terror. He would watch his master's gaze with a hawk-like intensity, searching for the slightest sign of waning interest. He saw rivals everywhere, especially in the younger boys who were constantly being brought into the household, their faces fresh and unlined, their bodies possessing the ephemeral grace he was now losing. His existence became a tightrope walk over an abyss of irrelevance. The actions of the other key figures in the household only amplified his terror. The master, once so attentive and affectionate, would become distant, his compliments less frequent, his visits shorter. His gaze would now linger on a younger attendant, a new favorite in the ascendant. The household staff, who had once treated the favorite with fawning respect, would now begin to treat him with a cool indifference, or even open contempt. They knew his time was limited, his power evaporating. The final, irreversible event was the day the master stopped summoning him altogether. This was the point of no return. There was no formal dismissal, no final confrontation. It was only silence. The silence from the master's quarters was the loudest sound in the world, a deafening proclamation of his obsolescence. He had been replaced. The system, which had raised him up, was now preparing to discard him. His purpose was fulfilled, his value expired. Perhaps no story illustrates the terrifying precarity of this existence better than that of Dong Xian, the most famous male favorite in Chinese history. During the Han Dynasty, under the rule of Emperor Ai, Dong Xian experienced a rise to power that was as meteoric as it was unprecedented. The emperor was utterly captivated by him, not just by his beauty, but by his gentle demeanor. Dong Xian was not merely a concubine. He became the emperor's most trusted confidant and companion. Emperor Ai showered him with honors, titles, and unimaginable wealth. He was made a marquis, appointed to high military command, and his family members were all given prestigious positions at court. The emperor's devotion was absolute. In a famous, though likely apocryphal, story, the emperor woke from a nap to find that Dong Xian had fallen asleep on the sleeve of his imperial robe. Rather than disturb his beloved, Emperor Ai took a knife and cut off his own sleeve. The incident gave rise to the euphemism, the passion of the cut sleeve, to describe intimacy between men. At the height of his influence, Emperor Ai even contemplated the unthinkable, abdicating the throne in favor of Dong Xian. He was stopped only by the horrified protests of the court ministers. For a brief, dazzling period, Dong Xian held a position of power that rivaled the emperor himself. He was the living embodiment of the ultimate fantasy for any male concubine, to transcend the role of a mere pet and become a partner, a power broker, a figure of immense consequence. But his entire existence was tied to a single thread, the life of the emperor. In the year 1 BCE, Emperor Ai, who had always been of frail health, died suddenly at the age of 25. The moment of the emperor's death was the climax of Dong Xian's crisis. The protective shield that had surrounded him vanished in an instant. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The Grand Empress Dowager and her powerful Wang clan, who had long resented Dong Xian's influence, seized control. They saw him not as a grieving partner, but as a dangerous political liability and an unnatural usurper of power. He was immediately stripped of all his titles and offices. The court, which had bowed and scraped before him only days earlier, now turned on him with venom. He was accused of corrupting the emperor and bleeding the treasury dry. There was no one to defend him. His power had been entirely derivative, a reflection of the emperor's affection, and with the source extinguished, the reflection disappeared. The new regime, eager to consolidate its power and restore what it saw as Confucian order, moved to erase him completely. The final act was clinical and merciless. Dong Xian and his wife were placed under house arrest, and then, to avoid the spectacle of a public trial, they were ordered to commit suicide. He was just 22 years old. His fall was as dramatic and total as his rise. The state moved to confiscate his vast fortune, and his family was exiled, stripped of their rank, and reduced to the status of commoners. His body was not given the burial befitting his former rank. He was buried quietly, shamefully, his grave unmarked. The official histories, written by the victors, portrayed him as a sycophantic, effeminate parasite who had led a good emperor astray. The story of the cut sleeve was transformed from a tale of love into a cautionary tale about the dangers of unnatural affections and the corrupting influence of favorites. The propaganda was ruthlessly effective. Dong Xian's entire existence was reframed as a political and moral catastrophe, his personal tragedy subsumed by the official narrative. His life stands as the most extreme example of the male concubine's fate. No matter how high they climbed, they were always just one heartbeat away from annihilation. The fates of the vast majority of male concubines, who never reached the dizzying heights of a Dong Xian, were far more mundane, but no less tragic. Once their youth and beauty faded, and they were cast aside by their masters. They faced a denouement of bleak and terrifying possibilities. The most fortunate among them might be pensioned off with a small sum of money, enough to live modestly for a short time, though they were often ill-equipped for life outside the sheltered, artificial world of the great houses. They had no practical skills, no family to return to, and bore the social stigma of their past. Many were simply turned out onto the streets, where they were vulnerable to disease, starvation, and violence. Their refined manners and soft hands made them easy prey. Some, still possessing a remnant of their former looks, might be sold to lower-class brothels that catered to a less discerning clientele, their descent from a gilded cage to a squalid prison complete. For others, the end came within the walls of the household itself. They were relegated to the most menial tasks, living as ghosts in the house where they once reigned as favorites, mocked by the servants and ignored by their former master, until illness or despair claimed them. Their deaths were as invisible as their lives had been artificial. There were no ceremonies, no mourners. The disposal of their remains was a practical matter, not a ritual of remembrance. They were non-persons, and their passing left no mark on the world. Their bodies might be wrapped in a straw mat and buried in an unmarked potter's field, or simply left for the elements. This final act of erasure stands in stark contrast to the immense value they held in their prime. A boy who had been purchased for a fortune, whose every whim was once catered to, whose training had cost a small fortune, was ultimately worth less than the silk robes he had once worn. This stark depreciation of human life highlights the core of the institution. It was never about the person, only about the ephemeral quality of youthful beauty. Once that quality was gone, the object was worthless and could be discarded without a second thought. The long-term consequence of this deeply ingrained practice was the reinforcement of a culture of absolute power and the commodification of the human body. It created a dark, psychological undercurrent in the elite strata of Chinese society, a tacit acceptance that certain people were simply instruments for the pleasure of others. While Confucianism preached order and propriety in public, this practice revealed the vast chasm between prescribed morality and private behavior. It demonstrated that for the powerful, the rules were negotiable. The system persisted through dynasty after dynasty, from the Han through the Tang, the Ming, and even into the Qing. The names and details changed, but the fundamental dynamic of exploitation remained the same. It became a permanent, if shadowy, feature of the social landscape. Historical debate on this topic has long been hampered by the nature of the sources. The victims themselves were voiceless, leaving behind no diaries, no letters, no accounts of their own experiences. We see them only through the eyes of others, in the lines of a poet admiring their beauty, in the dry records of a court official noting a payment, or in the moralizing condemnation of a Confucian scholar scandalized by a ruler's excesses. These sources are inherently biased, obscuring the human reality of the boys themselves. Modern historians are now attempting to read between the lines, to piece together a more accurate picture from these fragmentary and often euphemistic accounts. They challenge the romanticized notion of the cut sleeve, reinterpreting it not as a story of same-sex love, but as a story of a power imbalance so profound that true consent was an impossibility. This re-examination forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that what was sometimes framed as affection was, in reality, a form of profound and inescapable bondage. The ultimate moral of this dark chapter of history is a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the infinite human capacity for rationalizing cruelty. It is a story about what happens when a society allows one class of people to view another as objects. The elaborate justifications, the appreciation of aesthetics, the celebration of beauty, the veneer of high culture, were all just an elaborate scaffolding built around a core of brutal exploitation. The poetry, the music, the art, these were not tributes to the boys themselves, but decorations on their cages. They were taught to speak in the language of beauty to distract from the ugliness of their truth. This contrast between the public image and the private reality is the most haunting aspect of their story. The official portraits of emperors and officials show stern, dignified patriarchs, pillars of a well-ordered society. They do not show the terror in the eyes of the boy waiting to be summoned, or the despair of the young man who has just noticed his first wrinkle. In the end, the story of the male concubines of China is a story of ghosts. They are the spectral figures hovering at the edges of the official record, their individuality erased, their suffering silenced. For every Dong Xian whose name we know, there were thousands upon thousands whose names were forgotten the moment they were given, whose lives were consumed and discarded without a trace. They were the human cost of a system that valued power and pleasure above all else. As we look back into the perfumed, silent halls of imperial palaces and wealthy manors, we must remember to listen past the sound of the zither and the recitation of poetry. If we listen closely enough, we can still hear the silent screams of the beautiful boys who were forced to live and die as exquisite, broken things. Their tragedy is a timeless reminder that the pursuit of beauty can create profound ugliness, and that the grandest civilizations are often built upon foundations of quiet, unrecorded sorrow.